DevIntersection. And it's a conference down in Vegas. But one of the benefits of being able to go to a conference for SDG is that I get to give a brown bag about what I learned at the conference. So this is my opportunity to do that. It was a really good conference. I had a lot of fun. And one of the funnest things I did, Jen reminded me about this, one of the funnest things I did down there was I bought a Tesla in Vegas. So I went to Vegas. I learned some stuff, but I bought a Tesla, and that was the best part. So I think pretty much everybody in here knows me, but just to give a quick overview, I'm the .NET Practice Manager here at SDG Consulting. That means essentially that I pretend to know what .NET is, even though everybody knows more than I do. I'm the co-founder of the Salt Lake Azure Group. We run a user group twice a month, once here on the second Tuesday, once down at Vivint on the fourth Tuesday. And we do a lot of good Azure discussions and presentations. Anybody who's interested in that, we're really trying to grow, so please feel free to join us. I've been a Microsoft developer for longer than most people have been alive. I love the Microsoft stack. I love Azure. And that last one, 3 kids, 1 grandkid, and I love Jeeps and Teslas. So that's kind of me in a nutshell. Oh boy, I don't know. That's a tough, you know, I can't pick. It's like your kids. You can't pick your favorite kid, right? But I was telling my son the other day, I feel very lucky because I have my 2 dream cars, really, a Jeep and a Tesla. There's no other car that I really even want to own. So I'm feeling pretty. See, now that's coming in a couple of years. I'm waiting for that one. Then I can just have 1 car. I don't have to have 2 anymore. It's going to be awesome. All right. So what is DevIntersection? Well, DevIntersection is a great big developer conference down in Las Vegas, and it's put on by the guys that run .NET Rocks. I don't know if you guys ever heard of the .NET Rocks podcast. They're the ones that kind of run the show, but they're very tightly integrated with Microsoft. So they have a lot of great Microsoft speakers down there. If you guys know any of the Scotts, you got Scott Hanselman, Scott Guthrie, Scott Hunter. Yeah, he's the main one, actually. Scott Hanselman is one of my favorite speakers. He does a really good job, and he keynotes every year. So the conference is in Las Vegas, which is really nice because it's close enough to drive a Tesla home from. And there are several tracks. There's a Visual Studio track that concentrates more on the .NET stuff. There's a SQL Server track. And then this year, for the first time, they did an Azure AI track. And I kind of concentrated a little bit more on the Azure AI side of things because that's kind of where I'm trying to focus my energies. But there's thousands of people there, and it's just a really good opportunity to learn a lot of stuff and meet a lot of people. So what are we going to talk about today? So typically when I do a brown bag, I focus on a single topic. You know, I try to do a deep dive into a single topic. Today is going to be a little bit different. I'm going to try to hit a bunch of different points and just kind of give an overview of some of the things that I learned while I was down there. So we're not going to deep dive into any one thing, but hopefully we'll get some interest boiling on some various different things. So we're going to talk about .NET Core 3. So that's the new .NET Core that's coming out. It's in preview 2 right now. We're going to talk a little bit about microservices and what are they, and you know, some of the misconceptions that I had before I went in about microservices. We're going to talk about AI and how, you know, Terminator is going to become real. Azure AD B2C. That's one of my favorite things. I actually really started attacking that when I got back. That's a really way to add authentication and authorization to your web apps using a hosted Active Directory. Azure Data Services. So, you know, in Azure, there's tons of different ways to store and use data. We have SQL Server, and it's blossomed way beyond even SQL offerings now. There's tons of ways to do data in Azure. Then we're going to talk a little bit about Azure messaging and what thermal or temporal decoupling is. It's not a Star Trek term, though it does sound like that. And then if we have time, we're going to talk about how to build a time machine. So I thought that might be just a fun little way to cap off the... Okay, no, let's not go there because that's... Build that one first. Yeah, that's true. See, I don't want to do that first because then I actually have to do it. Before I get started, though, I wanted to give everybody something to think about in your brain, okay? So I don't know if you guys have ever heard of the radio show called Car Talk. Okay, it's an old radio show. They talk about cars. Anyway, they do this puzzler every time, and I really like this one puzzler. So I'm going to tell it to you. I'm not going to give you the answer, but I want you to think about it. So imagine that you have a long hallway, okay? And in that hallway, you have 20,000 light bulbs. And each of the light bulbs has a pull string on it. You know the kind where you pull it to turn it on and then pull it to turn it off, right? So you have 20,000 of these. They're all turned off. Some guy comes along and he pulls every string, which turns every light on, right? A second guy comes along and he pulls every second string. So what happens is every second light gets turned off, 2, 4, 6, 8, and so on. Third guy comes along and pulls every third string, 3, 6, 9, 12, and so on and so forth. They do this up to 20,000 guys, okay? Fourth guy does every fourth string. Fifth guy does every fifth string, and so on and so forth. How can you tell, if I ask you a number of a light, can you tell me if it's on or off? Okay, so think about that a little bit, and at the end, we'll see if anybody comes up with the answer. And I was going to bring a candy bar. If anybody comes up with the answer, you get a free sandwich. Okay, all right. Oh, or Jen has a candy bar. You get a free candy bar if you come up with the answer. This is a one-time deal. If you didn't get it, then you're out of luck. All right, so let's move on with the real stuff that everybody came here for. So let's talk a little bit about .NET Core 3. So what version of .NET Core are we at right now? Does anybody know? 2.2. 2.2, right? .NET Core 3 is going to be a bit of a departure from what .NET Core has been in the past. So one of the big selling points of .NET Core has been its cross-platform compatibility, right? You write in .NET Core, run it on Linux, run it on Mac, run it on Raspberry Pi. You can run .NET Core pretty much anywhere. .NET Core 3 is still going to have that capability, but they're building on that. So one of the things that they're going to put into .NET Core, which honestly surprised me a little bit, is they're going to put in the ability to build WinForms and WPF apps in .NET Core 3. Okay, so you're asking yourself, well, how does that work? How are they going to make a WPF app run on Linux? Well, they're not. Okay, so the WinForms WPF functionality of .NET Core 3 is going to be Windows only, but you'll be able to leverage all the other great stuff about .NET Core in Windows, WinForms and WPF apps. Who's still writing Windows native applications in .NET? Okay, well, you're at Cartera, right? Yeah, WPF. Okay, anybody else? So when .NET Core 3 comes out, if you want to, you can merge those over to .NET Core 3. Now, you may be asking yourself, well, how do I know if my application is going to be able to be ported over to .NET Core? Well, they have this thing called the .NET Core 3 Portability Analyzer. So let's really quickly, I'm going to bring up Visual Studio, and we're going to take a look at that. So you can see here, I'm using Visual Studio 2019. I'm going to bring up this Windows Forms app that I created the other day. And so if you look at here, we can right-click on this Windows Forms app, and we can analyze project portability. And that'll give us a report as to whether or not this thing even can be ported to .NET Core. There's some things where you may not be able to port an application. Let's say you're using some kind of an old plugin or an old OCX, maybe, ActiveX Control, if you guys remember what those are. There's some things that aren't portable, and so you may either have to rewrite them or just not port it. But this project portability analyzer will tell you if you can do that. And yeah.
Is that portable to .NET Core 3?
3, that's right.
Is it? Okay.
It's ported. Well, it'll tell you.
Was it portable to, say, a Linux or
so
outside of Windows?
If it's a WinForms app, the really easy way to tell if it's portable to Linux or not is to say no yourself, because no WinForms app is ever going to be portable to Linux. Okay. So this just tells you if it's portable to .NET Core 3, it's still going to be a Windows app.
But if it is portable to,
so this just tells you
3, then it's also portable to
that. No, see, that's the thing. With .NET Core 3, a WinForms app running on .NET Core 3 is still Windows only, okay? Now, you can use .NET Core 3 for your web apps and your web APIs and your .NET Core console apps. You can still use it for that stuff, and that stuff is cross-platform, right? That's still cross-platform just like it is today. But WinForms and WPF, even if they're running on .NET Core 3, are still Windows-only applications. Okay? And one thing that I found interesting is, so what's the default, what do .NET Core assemblies compile to? DLLs, right? They don't compile to exe. So how do you run a .NET Core DLL? You run it with the .NET runner, right? So .NET space blah, 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 .dll. These compile to exes, just like the old .NET framework does. So, so let's really quickly, I just wanted to take a look at, let's go into File. We're going to do a new project here. Let me open this up a little bit. So we're going to do a new project. So we can come in here to ASP.NET Core Web Application, and we're going to give it a name, hit Create, and then the next screen is similar to what you've seen before, where you pick your framework and you pick your type, right? So now we have ASP.NET Core 3, and you'll notice when I pick this that we get a couple of other options. We have Razor components. Has anybody in here tried anything with Blazor yet? Okay, you have a little bit. Does it? Okay, so Blazor is a client-side technology. I kind of think of it almost like Silverlight. If you remember what Silverlight is, you can write C# in the browser, right? Blazor is that same kind of thing. You can write C# assemblies that run directly in the browser using what they call WebAssembly. And Razor components are a way to do that in .NET Core 3. So you can just pick a Razor component project, build your Razor component, and then run it directly in the browser.
Is that compatible with the existing Razor format? Or just for 5?
Yeah, so it still uses Razor as its underpinning, but it's a little bit different because Razor, the way you're thinking, is a server-side tool, right? Yeah. This is client-side, so this will run in the client. Okay. I haven't played with these yet, but I think they're going to be really cool once we get them going. And the nice thing about this over Silverlight is Silverlight was a really awesome tool. I loved Silverlight, honestly, and if they still had it, I'd be a happy guy. The problem with Silverlight is that it had to have a browser plugin to work, and who doesn't like browser plugins? Apple, right? And if Apple doesn't like your stuff, it's not going to work, right? So this uses WebAssembly, and actually all the main browsers today support WebAssembly, even mobile browsers. And so you'll be able to use these kind of components which put C# directly back in the browser, which I think is kind of cool. All right, so let's go back to our presentation. Is coming with some pretty cool things. So one thing that C# 8 is going to give us is nullable reference types. So right now you can't have a null reference type, right? So this will give us nullable reference type the same way that we have. So it's also going to give us default interface implementation, which I thought was interesting. So if you define an interface today, there's no functionality in that interface at all, right? So let's say you define an interface, you have 20 different classes implement that interface. You go into that interface and add a new method into the interface. Well, what do you have to do to all 20 of those classes? You've got to go find every class and you've got to implement that method in every class, right? Well, what the default interface implementation will do is you can go into that interface, you can create a new method in the interface and give it default functionality. So then you don't have to go to all your classes and implement that unless you want to override that default functionality. So it's kind of abstract, classy, kind of, you know, but it's in the interface. They're also adding extension, what they call extension everything. So right now you can add extension methods, right? C# 8 is going to allow you to do extension properties as well. And And so we'll have to see how that comes out. Again, I don't know. I haven't tried that yet. Async streams. So now you can't do async streams in .NET Core 2.2. .NET Core, .NET Core 3 is going to give you async streams. And these things called switch expressions that make your switch statements a lot easier to read and use lambdas for your cases and stuff like that. So a lot of really neat stuff. The other thing that .NET Core 3 that I thought was pretty cool, they're going to include JSON support in the box. So right now, if you want good JSON support, what do you have to import? Newtonsoft, right? Everybody knows about Newtonsoft. It's the most popular NuGet package on planet Earth. .NET Core 3 is building in native JSON support as a class. So you can do JSON.write2, and it'll, it's like the old XML writer, if you remember that. And so it's going to be it's going to make it a lot easier to work with JSON. The one caveat to .NET Core 3 is you do have to have Visual Studio 2019, which has been in beta for a while. It's currently in preview 2, I believe. Does anybody know when it's going to be officially released? April 2nd. So keep your eye on that. They're going to have a big thing on April 2nd to officially release 2019. I've been using 2019 for a while for my personal projects, and it's awesome. So if you want to, you can download the preview of Visual Studio 2019 today, and you can start using it right away. And it'll work side by side with 2017, just like 2017 did with 2015. So, and you can install .NET Core 3 preview 2, and I've got all these links at the end of the slides, and so you can, and I'll make these slides available when we're all done. Okay, so any questions about .NET Core 3? You know everything about it now, so you should be good to go. I wish. Okay. All right, so the next thing I went to a class on was microservices. So what are microservices? So I always, you think of microservices and you think of these tiny little services, you've got 1,000 of them to run your application, right? Well, that's not necessarily the case. She made an interesting point that there's really no specific size for a microservice, right? That's what everybody asks. Well, how big should a microservice be? Well, it needs to be as big as it needs to be, right? And that's kind of the answer, which is a dumb answer. It's like the answer in programming is all, well, it depends, right? Can we do this? Well, it depends. And so microservices, there's no specific size. It's more of a functionality package, right? So your microservice is a package of functionality. If it's related functionality and it should be together, that's what goes in the microservice. And if it has to be this big or if it can be this big, it doesn't really matter. The microservice is a kind of a functionality package, right? So microservices have a couple of common characteristics. The functionality is all the same in a microservice. There's high cohesion within the service. So everything in the service is highly cohesive with everything else in the service. If there's something that doesn't quite fit, well, it needs to be in a different service, maybe its own or maybe a different one, right? In fact, they were even talking about some places use a microservice architecture, and each microservice has its own database. And then the other microservices don't even talk to the database of all the other microservices. The problem with that then is you have to worry about figuring out how to sync data between the databases. It seems a little overkill to me as I think about it. It just doesn't, that architecture doesn't quite mesh with the way that I see the world. But that's how serious you can get about microservices. I mean, you are so atomic that you don't even share data with anybody else. So one thing about microservices is it's heterogeneous technology, right? You can have this microservice over here written in C# running in an Azure App Service. This microservice over here is written in Go running in a Docker container on-prem. There's a microservice up there running Python in a Docker container in AWS. And these can all be microservices that belong to the same application. Now, one of the problems with doing that kind of thing, and that's kind of an extreme example. I mean, obviously, the obvious problem is that programmers, we think we're pretty good at stuff, but even we have to obey laws of physics, right? So if you have your stuff scattered all over the world, light and electrons can only travel so fast. And so you get latency issues and stuff like that. But the point is that you can do things like that if you need to. And your business domain really defines what your microservices architecture needs to be, right? Is anybody writing microservices today? Not really? Okay. And then microservices, there's a lot of ways to do them too, right? You can put them in Azure App Services. You can put them in AWS, equivalent to whatever an Azure App Service is, right? One of the most popular ways is to put them in Docker containers. Docker is really popular right now, and you can host Docker in a million different places. And so there's a lot of ways to do microservices. And so what's the big benefit of all of this decoupling, all of this, functionality gathering stuff? Well, it's going to be, you're going to have improved system resilience, right? So let's say you have a microservices architecture and one microservice goes down. Well, your entire application hasn't gone down, right? Just one little microservice. And so you can work around that failure a lot easier than if you have a monolithic web service that goes down and everything in your application is done at that point. So it kind of gives you some improved resiliency. And it also allows you to do scaling better, right? So if you have a microservice that gets really, really busy, you don't necessarily want it to be paired with functionality that doesn't get so busy, because you may want to scale this guy up really high to handle the traffic, but you don't want to pay for those resources for this guy over here because he doesn't need them, right? So it allows you to tailor your scaling to your business needs, all right? Microservices questions? No? Okay, all right. The next thing we talked about a lot was Azure AI. So they had one of those there, and that would have been cool though. So AI is artificial intelligence, right? And Azure has done a lot for the machine learning, Azure intelligence side of things. They talked a lot about, training your own machine learning models and, scrubbing your data. And they have all these tools. They have Jupyter notebooks. They have Databricks. They've got all of these things that are kind of like flying over me up here while I'm listening to all this stuff, right? So Azure has made machine learning, AI, a lot easier and a lot more accessible than it used to be. But to be honest with you, it's still kind of up there. I mean, it's not something that most people just jump in and start doing. But what they have done is that they've provided us with what they call their Azure Cognitive Services. Let me see if I can find, I had it up and, here we go. So we have Azure Cognitive Services. Azure Cognitive Services, you can think of these as kind of an AI in a box, right? So Microsoft has taken a lot of the most common things that people want from AI and made them RESTful endpoints that we can just call and get an answer back in JSON. Pretty danged amazing. So if you look at some of the things that we have in the Cognitive Services, we have the Vision API. What that does is that allows you to send a picture to the Vision API and get a JSON stream back of what's in that picture, all the objects that it can see. If it does facial recognition, it'll tell you who's in that picture. So at our last Azure user group, Brian Foster did a presentation on the Vision API, and he was training it so that he could give it a picture of one of his kids and it would tell him which one of the kids it was. Even though they were all baby pictures, and to me, they looked all the same. He may have just been screwing with us, and they may have been all the same for all I know. But he was training so he was doing a custom AI using the Vision API to train it to tell which one of his kids was. Now, to be fair, he needed to do a little more training because he sent in a picture of a zebra, and it gave it a 45% chance that it was his daughter. So I think his training, yeah, well, I'm not going to say exactly right. So there, it's even if you're doing custom AI, even with these tools, there's still some work to do. You have to train it, but they have speech APIs, for instance. So at UTA, we use the speech API to do text to speech. So we'll send it a string of text, and it'll send us a WAV file back with the computer voice speaking that text. They have search, they have knowledge, they have language. So you can out of the box, it gives you sentiment analysis, right? So you can pass in a comment that a customer left on the website, and it'll tell you if it's a positive comment or a negative comment. Now, one of the examples that we saw, it was for this vacuum company. And somebody said in a comment, this vacuum sucks really hard, okay? Now, a human knows that that's a good comment, right? Well, the computer came back and said that it was a negative comment because, well, it sounds like a negative comment. So even with these things, you can use them right out of the box, or you can train your own models, build on what they've done. And so that vacuum company would train it to say, okay, this is a good one. If it says it sucks really hard, it's good. If it says it sucks really bad, well, then it's not good, right? So you can train them. So the cool thing about it is that they give you all of these things right out of the box. You can do very little configuration if you want. That Vision API, seriously, you send a picture and it will return a JSON string. It's a RESTful API. I can't stress enough how amazing that is. It's a RESTful API. You send it either a picture or you send it a link to a picture and it'll tell you what that is. So we had a client that was going to use this, and what they were going to use it for is they wanted to be able to walk around somebody's house taking pictures of different rooms and have the computer tell them what room that was a picture of. So you take a picture of the kitchen. The computer says, okay, it's got a fridge, it's got a stove, this is probably a kitchen. You go into another room and take a picture. Okay, this one has a sink and a bathtub and a toilet, this is probably the bathroom. And so they wanted the computer to tell you what room it was and then tag that picture with those. And that's the kind of things you can do with this. Now, just recently, you can see that they have this big announcement. So they've made cognitive services now available on the edge. Does everybody know what the edge means? The edge was kind of an esoteric concept to me for a little while. Essentially, you have the cloud, right? You have Azure, and there's billions of dollars of servers somewhere up there, right? Well, the edge is devices that you have down here, right? So IoT devices, for instance. You may have a doorbell, right? That's an IoT device, a video doorbell. You may have a Google Home, for instance. That's an IoT device, right? Those are devices on the edge. Now, typically, those devices are pretty low-end, not really powerful processors. So they have to send their data up to the cloud. The cloud crunches it and sends back a response, right? So let's say you want your doorbell to do facial recognition. Well, what you would do is you would take the picture, send it up to the cloud, wait for it, and it would send you back who that is. What they're doing with the cognitive services on the edge is they're making prepackaged Docker containers that contain these cognitive services. So you can take a Docker container with the face recognition API, stick it on your little Raspberry Pi that runs your doorbell, and do all of the facial recognition right on the edge device without having to communicate to the cloud all the time. I mean, if you think about it, that's amazing. So if you lose your connection to the internet, that's okay. You're processing on the edge, and then you'll send the results to the cloud, or you'll do whatever else you need with the cloud. But a lot of the work can be done at the edge rather than in the cloud. And that was just announced recently. So I think that's pretty cool. So another thing that, let's see. So another thing that they talked a lot about was ML.NET. If you don't know what ML.NET is, it's a really powerful library to write your own machine language or machine learning tools in .NET, right? So typically when you do machine learning in the recent past, you've either had to use Python or R, or Python or R, I guess. That's pretty much the main ones. What ML.NET does is it allows you to use C# to build your machine learning models. And while developers always like to learn new languages and learn new things, the reality is that if you can leverage your skill set already, you're going to be that much further ahead, right? So this ML.NET is a way to leverage your C# or maybe VB.NET, I'm not sure, your .NET skills directly, yeah, right? Directly to build your machine learning models. So they're doing a lot of stuff in the machine learning AI space. And it's only going to get better, right? I mean, AI is, everybody wants AI everything. In fact, I was talking to somebody the other day, I think it was Brett. Anyway, he was saying how when it's time for him to go home from work, his phone pops up and tells him what the traffic is going to be like on the way home. Because it's learned when he leaves work, and it's proactively giving him information on his drive time to get home. He didn't have to do anything. It just learns as it goes. So watch your phones because they're watching you all the time, right? Be careful. All right, so the next thing that we talked about, I took a little class on authentication in Azure because I'm writing some mobile apps and I wanted to figure out what the best way to do authentication is, right? Because when you do a mobile app, you kind of need multiple ways to log in, right? We call it single sign-on, right? You need to be able to, you can create your own account, or do you want to log in with Google, or do you want to log in with Facebook, right? So managing all of that, I had a hard time understanding, well, how do I make all of that work? How do I manage all of that? So I started looking at this Azure AD B2C, and they talked about it. This is Azure Active Directory Business to Consumer. And what it is it allows you to go into Azure and set up an AD tenant that you can then manage all authentication up in the cloud. So all you have to do then is from your application, you just have to make a call into Azure, and Azure will provide the login screen. It will provide the links to all of the third-party login providers, and it will take care of all of that stuff for you behind the scenes. All you do is you make a call and you get back a token. It's unbelievable. So we're going to just take a quick peek at that. Let's see. So I'm going to bring up my Azure. I'm going to do that in Chrome, though, actually, I think. Let's turn this off. This up. So I'm going to bring up my Azure portal. And let's pick the correct one. So I'm currently writing a couple of Xamarin apps that are also going to have a web front end. And so I was concerned, well, how do I make my Xamarin login with the same login as my web app? And how do I make that all work with Google and stuff? And Azure AD B2C is the answer to that. So if we go look at all resources, I'm going to go into, oh, there it was. Okay. I know it's on here because I just saw it. There it is. So this is what they call a B2C tenant. And so when you do Azure AD B2C, you have to set up a B2C tenant inside of your Azure portal. And you can see, you know, it has just a couple of things. There's not really much you can do for it here, but here's where the magic is. You go into Azure AD B2C settings, and this is where you do all of the work. So we can go in here and we can look at applications. So I've got two applications that I've tied to this tenant. So I've got my, I'm writing an app called Tesla Tracker. So I've got a Tesla Tracker mobile, that's my mobile app. And I got a Tesla Tracker API, that's my API app. So with those two tied into here, I can use the Azure AD B2C to authenticate to those. And it's really cool because now what you do is you come into providers. Right now, I only have email defined for this, which means that when they go to log into my app, it's just going to have them create an account with their email. Okay? But let's say I want to use Google. I want to give them the ability to do Google. All we need to do is we need to go to add. We need to select an identity provider. And those are all the identity providers that we can add. So let's say we want to do Google. We would pick Google. Now, there is a little bit of work you have to do for these identity providers. Obviously, it doesn't just work, right? So for Google, for instance, you have to go to the Google Developer Portal. You have to register your app with Google, and then you get a client secret and a client ID that you then put into Azure AD. So once you have those two pieces of information, then when you go in and click Login, it takes you to the Microsoft login site. Oh, there's a button for Google on it now. You do the same thing for Facebook. The next time you go in, oh, there's a button for Facebook now. So the authentication is completely abstracted away from you. All you do is you make a call to login.onmicrosoft.com with your key, and then it returns to you a token. It's a JOT token that you can use to do authentication and authorization throughout the rest of your application. It's unbelievably easy to do. Well, it took me a while to get it set up, but once I got it set up, it worked really well. So you can see we've got a lot of different providers. We've got Facebook, LinkedIn, Amazon, Weibo, QQ. I mean, who doesn't want to use QQ to log in, right? I have no idea what that is. Yeah, probably, right? Just not my side of the world. And then you can even set up a custom identity provider using OpenID Connect. So I think you could use things like Identity Server. You can use Okta. You can use any of these other third-party providers, tie them into here, and then this is your single authentication portal for every app that you need to build. So it's really powerful, really amazing, and it works really well. Let's see, oh yeah, so the other thing that you do is you go into user flows, and this is where you can set up your, so I've set up a sign up and sign in. So you would go into here and you can customize the way your page look, your login page looks. So you provide custom HTML in here, and then it would use that to render the login page. You can put your logo on it, you can put whatever you want on it. You can customize the login page, you can customize the attributes that you want to capture. So when it returns that JOT token, right, when you get a token, it's essentially an encoded JSON stream, right? So it would have all these different tokens. You might want to capture their first name, you might want to capture their last name, you might want to capture, you know, their height or whatever. You can capture that information and it will return all that as part of the JSON token. No, you can add custom. So if you log in with Google, if they log in with Google, it will still ask you for those other pieces of information when they first sign up and then return those to you. So the UI would allow them to log in with Google, but they have to enter these other pieces of information also. On the first round, that's right. That's right, and it'll remember them from that point forward. Yep. So this handles all of that. So all you need to store in your application at that point is either their user ID that you get back, or maybe their email address, something so that you can identify them when they log in and bring back the token. So you don't have to keep any of their personal information stored in your database. You're letting Azure handle all that for you. Makes privacy really, really easy to deal with, and makes it a lot easier to deal with all the legal ramifications of gathering data, right? Let's see. There's one other thing I was going to say. No, I can't remember.
Do you have over the token, like expiration?
Yeah, you have.
Auto renew and all that stuff.
So it handles all of your refresh tokens for you automatically. You don't have to deal with anything. And then you can set the expiration in here. And I believe that is actually in here somewhere. I can't remember where that is, but you can set your own expiration. But the nice thing is that since this is handling everything, if they go, so in the API, you would call a acquire token silent async. That's the method to call. If you call that, it will come back and tell you, hey, this refresh token's expired. You can't just get a token. At that point, you need to do an interactive login, and then you call the next one, and then it'll do the interactive part. So, and if you don't need to do an interactive login, it'll just return you a token, and you're good to go. So it makes it really easy to deal with all of that stuff. The one last thing I did want to mention on this is multi-factor authentication. This has multi-factor authentication all built in. So if I wanted to enable multi-factor authentication for this user flow, I have multi-factor authentication in my application, right? I mean, how easy is that? It's amazingly easy. Yeah, so that's a good question. I don't know. I haven't done it yet. I'm gonna have to try that. It's probably, I'm sure it uses the Authenticator app in some way, or texting. I'll have to play with that. That's a good question. But so here's where you set your token lifetimes and stuff. Yeah. Oh yeah. You can set that. Now this so to log in, so like on your mobile device, it actually launches a browser and then has you log in through the browser. They do that because that's more secure than doing it through the app itself. But there are APIs that you can call this directly if you don't want it to call out to a browser. Calling out to the browser, though, it's really easy and it works really well. I haven't tried it on iOS yet. That's kind of my very last thing I'm going to try. And so I'm going to do a full-blown presentation on Azure AD B2C at our user group meeting next month, the one up here. The one down south is going to be different, but the one up here on the 12th is going to be a demo and how to set this up and how it actually works. So we're not going to get into the details here, but that will be Tuesday the 12th. It's not very expensive at all. I mean, I haven't even seen it impact my Azure credits yet. So it's really cheap. to do. And I don't know exact dollar amounts, but it hasn't affected my balance yet. It's really cheap. Yeah. All right, let's try this again. Okay, so let's talk about, I think I missed a slide. Let me make sure. Okay, so the next thing I wanted to cover was some Azure data services. So in Azure, right, almost every application that we write requires data storage of some type, right? I mean, even if you're writing games, you have to store data of some type somewhere. If you don't, then your app is kind of bordering on useless because it has no state or whatever. I mean, I'm sure there are some cases, but we do store data a lot. And Azure provides us with a whole bunch of different ways to store data. Obviously, we have Azure SQL, right? It's SQL Server. That's Microsoft's bread and butter database. Azure SQL is fully supported, obviously. We also have managed SQL. So, and I've talked about this before. You guys have probably heard me talk about it. Azure SQL is 96.38% compatible with on-prem SQL Server, right? Managed SQL tries to get you to 100% compatibility. So it's still a managed database, but it's a little bit, it kind of tries to go between Azure SQL and on-prem, where you still get the managed capabilities, but have the capabilities of your on-prem. So if you need something like that, managed SQL is the way to go. Obviously, you can still spin up a VM and host any database you want in a VM, right? As long as it'll run on Windows and Linux. But some of the other managed data services that Azure provides is they provide MariaDB. Does anybody know what MariaDB is? No, Dave does. MariaDB is a fork of MySQL that somebody did because Oracle bought MySQL. And so these guys forked it to MariaDB so that they wouldn't be beholden to Oracle anymore. So it's essentially MySQL with a weirder name. I don't know, maybe that's his wife's name. I don't know.
Several of the developers who were leading MySQL moved over.
Split, yeah, went off to MariaDB. And MariaDB is a great database. We do use it at UTA. It's a really good alternative to MySQL. And then, like I said, you don't have to worry about Oracle because, you know, who knows? Oracle may come out someday and say, hey, MySQL's not free anymore. Everybody pay up, right? Can't imagine Oracle doing that. I know, right? They do also offer MySQL as a managed data service. They offer Postgres. So if anybody, now Postgres is a good database. It's really, really high performant. And they offer Postgres Community as a managed service in Azure. Now, what does managed service mean? Well, managed service means that it's a serverless almost option, right? You don't have to spin up a VM. You don't have to worry about patches. You don't have to worry about all of that stuff. It's managed for you. All you have to worry about is the database piece of it. You don't even have to patch the database, right? Because it's managed, it's taken care of for you. Cosmos DB is their NoSQL, or one of their NoSQL offerings. It's based on MongoDB, if you know anything about Mongo. But what they say about Cosmos DB is that it's planet scale data. And so with Cosmos DB, you can have replicated instances of your Cosmos DB around the world, and they guarantee some millisecond latency for replication to all nodes in your Cosmos DB data. And that's amazing. Obviously, again, we have the laws of physics to contend with. But as long as laws of physics cooperate, you get really, really fast replication. Now, Cosmos DB is not the cheapest way to go, but if you need super high performant reads and in a NoSQL platform that are globally consistent, Cosmos DB is unbeatable.
Well, I was at Microsoft in 2009, incubating that their ad center.
Yeah.
Like Google AdSense.
Oh, huh? Yeah. So, and back then when it started, it was called Document DB, right? Was it Cosmos back then too?
Well, I don't know how that got productized.
Well, one thing is Microsoft does like to change names of things, so who knows what it was called every time, right? Yeah, that's right. Oh wait, Silverlight's a bad word now. We got to get rid of it. But no, Cosmos DB is really. I mean, and even with any of these, even with Azure SQL, you can have geo-replicated databases, right? I mean, it's super easy to set up geo-replication in Azure. You set up your database, you go into the geo-replication tab, you say, oh, okay, I want it now to be in Europe. Click, okay, now you have a geo-replicated database. You're paying for it, right? But if that's what you need, then you're willing to pay for it. So, and that's another thing we're going to do a user group meeting on is some ways to do geo-replication for databases and web services to have a completely disaster recovery solution in Azure, because like for app services and stuff, it's not easy to geo-replicate those necessarily, but anyway. So any questions on databases? Okay. All right.
There's a question on the chat.
Oh, okay. So we will show the Azure AD B2C, which includes roles, and it scopes. And scopes is kind of how you do roles in Azure AD. So we'll go over all of that on how to assign roles and how to authorize your web APIs. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, so we'll go all the way from authentication to authorization on a web API. Okay. All right. So one of the next things that we talked about that I thought was really cool is Azure messaging. Okay, and this is what I was talking about, the temporal decoupling. So everybody's probably heard of message queue servers. I mean, back in the day, there was Microsoft Message Queue. We have RabbitMQ. We have Kafka, which is an Apache thing. And these are essentially just ways to, you send a message from a client, and then the client forgets about it. It doesn't care what happens with it after that. All it knows is that it sent it where it needed to go. And then you have these consumers over here that read out of that queue and process those messages. So what that does is that allows us to decouple our logic, and it allows us to make things more resilient, right? So the client is not requiring a direct connection to the consumer, because what happens when your producer is sending something and the network goes down? Well, you'll lose that, right? And that's a fragile way to have your communication go on. So unless you need real-time communication, then message bus is a really good way to do things. You send a message up, and eventually, it could be milliseconds, it could be hours, who knows, but eventually that message will get taken care of. And the time lag between the two is obviously something that you set up and that you figure out what you want and what you're willing to deal with as far as consistency is concerned. So Azure supports all kinds of different ways to do messaging. And so the temporal decoupling, that term that I thought was so cool, essentially it lets you do things at a time that you want. You're not constrained by the time. So you're not saying, hey, I need this done right away. You're saying, get to it when you can, I'll know about it. So I like to ask this question when I talk about this topic. Has anybody ever used, not necessarily just in the development space, has anybody ever used asynchronous messaging before? Okay, everybody put up your hand real quick. Every single person, okay? Has anybody ever sent an email? That's asynchronous messaging, right? Texting, asynchronous messaging. Sometimes when my wife talks to me, it's asynchronous messaging because I'm not paying attention. Right? So there's all kinds of asynchronous messaging in the real world as well as in development. Don't tell her I said that. Oh, nobody here knows her, so that's good. So we have Service Bus, Event Hubs, and Event Grid. Those are the three first-class citizens in the Azure messaging space, right? Those are all managed. Those are all services that Azure provides. Then we have Kafka, we have RabbitMQ. Those are third-party services that are available in Azure. So like if you've ever used Kafka before, it's a really robust messaging platform. But in Azure, you have to host it in a VM or in a Docker container. So there's a little bit more work to get Kafka configured and working and scaling and stuff like that. Service Bus, Event Hubs, and Event Grid, they're just an Azure service that are managed. And so if you want to scale it up, you go click, and then you can scale it up. So there's a lot of really good solutions for messaging in Azure. This is the resources slide. So I'll make this available. If you're interested in any of the topics, these are some links I found that go into more depth on all of them. And I suspect that as we're going through not only the Azure user group, but brown bags throughout this year, I'm sure that we'll be having presentations on a lot of these. And if anybody's interested in doing a presentation of brown bag, I am more than happy to allow you to do that because I get tired of talking all the time. So unfortunately, we're out of time. So I'll just show you the time machine I built, and then we'll have to talk about how I did that at a later date. I know, I was like, crap, how can I stretch this out? So do we have any questions about anything? Is there anything on the chat thingy? Okay. All right, then, yeah, I guess we're done. Thank you for coming, and we'll see you next time. Thank you, Jen.